working with local villages and, amazing work in a culture that does not have a huge amount of respect for strong opinionated women. So it's really glad that she's here with us, working in our team. Do you want to hand me the clicker?
Yes.
Thanks, babe. So I sent through the agenda to you guys. So these are the 5 things that we're going to cover today. After we do the recap, the 4 things that are after that, we're going to present a few slides and then have a discussion on each of those things. So we're really interested in giving you enough kind of background information that you can have an informed discussion, but we're really interested in your points of view because you are, the people who talk to the people more than we do. You'll see throughout this presentation that we're marking the draft concept with a scarecrow. So we've developed a straw person. So whenever you see the straw person, it's to mark that this is our draft idea. So it is not set in stone, it is up for discussion. So you'll see that throughout the presentation. And Jemina, do you want to talk to the next couple of slides?
Yeah, just to add to the straw person that we very much welcome your feedback on these drafts. So it's a reminder that please pull it apart and give us your feedback. So you can move on to the next slide. So just to recontextualise ourselves about the strategic context of adaptation, I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with this already, but I thought it would be good just to recap that in Te Atakura, that adaptation has been set out by Council as one of the the flip side to the mitigation work. So there's a whole work stream around adaptation, and Council asked for us to work on an adaptation plan, an approach for engaging the community and for integrating adaptation into the BAU of Council, particularly in our project management and asset management. In the Te Atakura update, which I understand you've had a draft, you've seen the draft. So those areas of adaptation, so we now have 4 action areas that the adaptation work program is focused on. So understanding the problem, developing a strategic approach to adaptation, working with local communities and advocating for policy improvements. So within each of those quadrants, there's a number of different projects that sit under that works program. It's all interrelated, and what the workshop we're going to kind of deep dive into is the yellow areas today, mostly the working with communities bit. Yeah. Thanks, Alison. So this is our first scarecrow. So our first draft concept that we're bringing to you. So it's about that first quadrant, the developing the strategic approach. So you'll see on this slide, it's a timeline of what we'd be proposing to include in a roadmap for adaptation that will bring together how all of the different projects come together to support adaptation outcomes.
So our plan with this roadmap is that we take your input from today, develop a draft adaptation roadmap that includes principles of engagement and the activities we're going to do, bring that back to councillors for feedback and then go out for public consultation before formally adopting it as our program of work. So this is the current kind of draft of what might be in that roadmap, and obviously we'll flesh this out more before we bring it back to council. Yes?
Timeline?
Timelines are for bringing the roadmap in. I would hope that we would be able to workshop the draft roadmap. I think we're waiting for the regional impact assessment first. Maybe
I think we don't need that to be
to go ahead.
Finalised.
Okay, so maybe before Christmas we would be showing councillors something.
Yeah.
Is this what we're planning to spend some of the money that will come from Better Off funding on, this kind of program?
So developing the program is already funded under Te Atakura. Delivering the program and how much community adaptation we do, how quickly and how much we bring forward. If we get the Better Off funding application from DIA, then we would be able to scale that up and do more in a shorter time period.
So this is kind of the plan for that fund.
Can you just put your microphone on if you're asking, just because otherwise people, can you just repeat that very quickly?
So I'm sorry about that. For the benefit of those online, I just asked if this program was sort of part of what the Better Off funding might provide for, and the answer was the roadmap itself is already, that development is funded, but anything that comes out of it, yes, that might be where the Better Off funding could be applied if we granted it from DIA.
Thanks, Sarah. Before we move on, does anybody have any other questions on that? So the parts of the roadmap we're deep diving to in this workshop is that it is highlighted in red.
Yeah, so I do have a question about the timeframes. Like I say, 40 years too late on everything. I'm just a bit worried about the 10-year timeframe for getting all the planning done. Like, it's too long. Like it's here. Climate change is here. So I'm just wondering, what resources would you need to truncate that to 5 years? So.
Yeah, so I think when we've done the detailed planning of the roadmap, we'll have a better idea of what communities we're going to or areas and when, and that's when we can start looking at that detailed resourcing conversation. So if we get the DIA funding, obviously we'd be able to achieve more sooner. But yes, there's definitely something we can discuss with the next council in terms of how we would speed it up and make it faster.
And obviously I'm interested in council assets all over the city rather than just going into particular communities which have high risk, because that is our job to protect those assets at least. I think that's uncontroversial, hopefully. The private ones will be more difficult. Right, Laurie, and then...
Kia ora, just checking the step in between coming back to councillors at Christmas and looking at the dotted line with working with local communities. Will we work with local communities to get the draft roadmap to council?
We're planning to go out to public consultation, so I'm imagining Eugene will give us feedback on it. But yeah, the idea is that we have heard quite a bit from the coastal community groups, from Eugene. We're getting input from you. We're going to put together that draft for council to consider and go out to public consultation with that draft, so be able to get widespread across many stakeholder feedback on the roadmap before we adopt it.
Just to move on from that, I think with some of the Ahotini and economic development strategy, we did well working with stakeholders prior to the draft. In fact, it almost helped us because... Yeah. So I just asking that there will be an opportunity for interested stakeholders to contribute prior.
Yep, definitely. And we have at the end of this presentation a discussion of what we're doing between, like, over the next 6 months, which does include a lot of chatting to communities. So it's not like we're not, we go silent and produce a roadmap. It's trying to do all of the things at the same time, but without, I guess, tripping over ourselves or doing stupid things. But yes, doing all of the things at once. Right. And thank you for that feedback, Laurie.
Thank you. Just acknowledging it's not part of today, but when will the CBD adaptation and the council asset adaptation be coming back?
We're working on the council adaptation work in preparation for the 2024 LTPs. So I'm sure you know in Siobhan's area, they've recently appointed somebody to look at asset management. Plus we have the project management office as well. So we're integrating this work with with them, with the intention that budgetary implications of that would be available for this LTP. I doubt we'll be able to have a full picture by this LTP because it's a lot of work, but at the very least, understanding some of the major risks or major cost implications.
And CBD?
In terms of the CBD adaptation, it really depends on how much money we have. We need to understand the technical options, and that will mean paying consultants to understand what can and cannot be done. So it will depend a little bit on how much DIA funding we have. And if that is something that councillors wish us to prioritise, then we would probably have to come back at annual plan time for more money.
Yes, please.
Well, then, Sarah.
So my question is just about working with communities, how you're planning, I guess, to engage with the communities who have already, spent quite a bit of time and have had a big gap in between. So thinking of Mākara, I guess the Mākara o Hariu Community Board, how we bring in communities that possibly will be feeling a little bit unsure if we're going to be able to actually do anything because they haven't seen much happen. So just how you're planning to do that, and I guess also other communities like the southern part of the city, and then also the Tawa Community Board with some of the work we've already done around the stream with community. But just how you're going to sort of, because obviously you need to consult with everybody, but there's a few communities that have kind of already been on this journey for a while, and we need to kind of, I guess, look after people who are, important in the process.
Specifically on Mākara, we have, there's work that we're doing in this financial year to look at what the technical options were that were developed in the last piece of work that got done with Mākara, and that will be coming back for consideration for the next annual plan. So that conversation is ongoing. The conversation with Awhiro is ongoing. So, Brad's still working on the monitoring system. Eugene, met with you yesterday and is part. We want to have his input into different projects that we're doing. So I think I totally get your point, and we want to continue. But the purpose of today's workshop, I think, is to get your input as to, in this very complicated world, how would you like us to proceed? What would be your advice? Because there are some gnarly issues that we're now going to sort of cover off as we go through today.
I think the community wants to see us being brave because they're sort of, at the moment we're being confronted by it all the time. So it's never a better time than when you've got hillsides crumbling.
That's right, Sarah.
My question is, how do you plan to engage with iwi through this process?
We have a whole separate thing on that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No.
You were just waiting for the question.
Yeah, a great question.
So, so you'll cover that later?
Yes, we'll cover that later. Yeah.
I'll just make a brief comment that I did envisage a more participatory approach rather than our standard consultation one, and hopefully if mana whenua have the time and the resources, we enable them that it would be a more culturally inclusive approach. So just sort of going up for consultation and getting people to feedback.
So we're kind of going straight to the end of the workshop before we do the workshop, because at the end of the workshop is what are we going to do in the next 6 months? Yep. So once we've had all of the other discussions, you can then give us some very good feedback on what you think good looks like between now and the end of the year, and we will then go and make that happen.
Right, good. Okay, good. Okay, so we will proceed.
If you want some feedback, I think it would be good to see that up front, though, the iwi engagement. Yeah.
Okay, all right, so you'll proceed now. Good, thank you.
Yes, you're right. We haven't used the word mana whenua engagement anywhere on that roadmap. And I think it's because in the earlier, if we think of this, we think of all of Te Atakura work as grounded in Māori and grounded in a Te Ao Māori point of view. So for us, it's like a common thread that goes across the bottom. So you would probably in a roadmap, you would see how mana whenua would be involved across time as a separate piece once we develop that with them.
Okay.
Great point, Sarah. Okay. Back to the policy context.
Great. And I'm not going to labour this because I assume that everybody knows this very, very well. But just to highlight that the National Adaptation Plan was actually released last week, which is excellent to get a bit more clarity for us here in local government in terms of what's coming in terms of the support from national government in the next 6 years. But really just to say that there's still a lot of uncertainty in the policy landscape that makes operationalising local level adaptation very challenging, particularly given the lack of clarity in the funding and financing of options, particularly for retreat conversations. So that context kind of it really just sets the stage for this conversation with you today. And as Alison mentioned, we're really looking for some feedback and some guidance from all of you about how you think we should proceed.
Noting that Climate Change Act is meant to cover what funding and financing mechanisms would be available across a range of different potential reactions that you can have. So you can do nothing. You can accommodate the water, you can protect against the water, you can avoid the water, or you can relocate away from the water. So there's a wide variety of things that you can do. Currently, the only part of that that's possible to do right now is do nothing, which, you know, we're arguably doing a great job of nationwide. And in that scenario, the full cost of adaptation falls to the homeowner, hence their anxiety. Right, like it doesn't, in theory, sum to the insurance companies. And we have funding mechanisms that support the building of things like seawalls, so we can do kind of protect, but avoid in terms of regulatory mechanisms that allow us to smoothly change how zoning is applied, or funding for accommodation of water or funding for planned relocation. That those funding mechanisms are not around. There's no budget for that allocated from anybody. So that's the high level of expectation that we have of the Climate Change Adaptation Act, is that there'll be some guidance as to what central government sees as the future of funding those different things, or what mechanisms might be available. You can compare it to the structure that's available for earthquake risk, for example. It's very clear how the allocation of cost will be split and what funding mechanisms are available to cope with earthquake risk, and that same clarity is not yet available for climate change driven risks. That's what we're hoping for.
Well, then we're stuffed. We're stuffed. If that's the model. Right.
So this is our first topic that we're going to talk. We're going to dive into this funding uncertainty. Jamuna, take it away.
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of this we've already talked about today. Really, I just wanted to highlight that I know that the council knows this challenge of being able to fund adaptation very well. You know, building off the example with Makara, this is a very common challenge that all councils in New Zealand are really facing. It's not a Wellington City Council only issue, but certainly a challenge nationally. We know that we can go through a best practice community engagement planning process, but where councils tend to get kind of stuck in the process is how to be able to fund action and to be able to implement it.
As we saw at Makara and Ofuro Bay.
Yes, exactly. So,
and we will send this slide pack around to you afterwards, because it's got quite a lot of detail on it. So, yeah, so you don't have to sort of furiously take notes in this. No. But the key points to note from these is Makara Beach kind of came to a stall over funding. So it was proposed that a special levy be struck that shared the cost between council and the homeowner. That levy was quite large compared to the current rates bill of those houses, and they didn't agree to pay it. And then the conversation kind of derailed at that point. So a new crop of councillors, a new set of officers, and the conversation just kind of stalls. And Awhiro Bay, we have agreement to do the beach grading as a pilot, but we still don't have a long-term kind of plan of forward options, so we haven't developed a full pathway, and obviously it's not costed what that pathway would be, and because it's serendipitous that for Awhiro Bay the short-term solution was relatively affordable, so we decided we could fund that within our existing operational budgets. If the short-term solution had been very expensive, then we would have been in a situation of trying to figure out what to do about that. And what I find the hardest about this is that both of these processes were started in the absence of having that council framework around what fairness looks like and how we're going to distribute our investment in adaptation and how we're going to prioritise our investment in adaptation across different communities from an equity perspective, a fairness perspective and affordability. So without that kind of framework, it's very hard for US councillors to make decisions on how much money to spend on a particular community's pathway if you don't understand how many communities are at risk, what they're all going to cost, who is most at risk, where the equity issues are. So that's what we would like to be able to deliver to you over the next year or two is a better framework and context from within which you can make these sorts of decisions.
Are you able to find out how much the Makara residents were being asked to pay? It would just be useful to know. It would be really just to see where the intolerance was. Was it half the rates bill or?
I think it was like double the rates bill.
Right.
It was quite a lot of money because those properties aren't didn't have high values.
No.
Yeah. It was a small number of houses, a large amount of money, and the properties weren't worth a lot, so the rates bills were low.
And they were, how long would be required to pay that money? Was it over 10 years or 5 years or?
I think it was 10 years from memory.
Yeah.
I'd have to look at
the
details.
That's really valuable.
We are working on a case. Thank you for that feedback, because we are working on a case study about the Makara Beach pilot that we're going to publish later this year. So we will include that analysis in there for your information, where we really dive into how it was run, what we learnt, and how that would feed into our future work. Jamuna?
And I think, our experience with Makara and Awhiro Bay, I think we can contextualise that with what other councils are doing as well. So I've presented on this slide, there's just some other examples from other councils in New Zealand about, I guess, the range of different ways that councils are trying to tackle the funding challenge for adaptation. So,
Can you read a few of those?
Yeah,
it's really small.
Yes, I know.
I think we can read.
I'll go through them.
Screen or?
Yeah, so I think for me there's a couple that really stand out. So Christchurch City Council, for example, they have been quite clear in their recent adaptation framework in terms of what they do and they don't cover. They've quite explicitly talked about the limitation of spending public funds on public assets and have called that out. Whereas on the other side, Northland District Council have been much more open-ended about both in terms of the funding that they will seek, the funding, the range of different options. So they mention targeted rates, lease-back arrangements, low interest rates, so a whole range of different funding mechanisms. But the other thing to note also is that some councils at the beginning of the process will clarify where the funding comes from, and others leave it very open-ended and say we'll figure out the funding later as part of the process. So there's looking at what other councils are doing, I think there's some good lessons there, but I don't think anyone's really solved it yet.
No. When I first started working on adaptation, Liam, my boss, said to me, can you just do some research and find someone, surely another council in New Zealand or Australia has sorted this shit out and knows what they're doing and and we can just like copy it across and do what they're doing. And I was like, no. Was the conclusion of that research. It was like there are good examples of specific pieces of work, but there is not a single council that has sorted this out. And to a large extent, that's because we need guidance on central government policy. And the National Adaptation Plan is a great step forward, and the Climate Change Adaptation Act will also significantly help. So,
but you also, I know it's only one politician, but you heard James Shaw saying don't necessarily rely on the government.
Oh yeah, they're not going to want to pay for it either. But this is like a giant game of chicken, right? It's like the insurance companies, the banks, central government, local government, private homeowners all staring at each other going, who's paying for this? Yeah, and we have to navigate a path through that.
And that's why I'm worried, because the earthquake legislation basically put 100% onto owners. Sarah.
There are some examples like at Hawke's Bay where they've, I'm thinking of the beach, Havamana Beach, and then also down on the West Coast where they've had real problems, but they don't feature here in this list. Is that because they haven't got any plans to deal with it? Are they doing case by case? What's the story?
It's not intentional. Hawke's Bay is up there, and you can't read it because it's so small. So apologies about that. But I have put a small snippet in there about Hawke's Bay Regional Council. So they have proposed for the adaptation actions that are benefiting private owners, that they've proposed an 15% split, with the majority being paid by the property owners.
And that was 21,000-ish if they want to pay the whole lot. 22.
So it's a lot of money. Yeah. Can you click through to the next slide? Sorry, Alison. Yes. So, and I think, it sounds like a great solution in theory, but for this case where 2 of, I think, the 18 properties have pulled out, it has created a dilemma for what to do and how to continue to fund the wall. No clear answers just yet, but there is, I guess, a trend for councils to be much more explicit with how they communicate with the community about how we can use public funds as part of the engagement process. So on this slide, I'm really just kind of highlighting that there's a continuum of different approaches, and at one end there's the very open-ended approach where councils like Northland are looking at a range of different options throughout the process, whereas Christchurch City Council have been much more upfront at the beginning of the process that that the use of public funds will be for public assets, and they also go on to say that if private assets need to be paid for, that they'd be expecting the private asset owners to contribute. So being really upfront about that.
It's quite a good word, but keeping in mind public funding comes from the public.
Yep.
Given that's the biggest driver of council funding, it's rates.
Yep.
So that hopefully does give some guidance about how the money should be split, right?
Yep.
Well, we do, we have policies with every activity that council does where we decide how much is going to be funded by the individuals benefiting directly from the thing, and how much is going to be, exactly. And I think with this one, that's what we're lacking is a nationally consistent approach to that. Every council is trying to figure this out for themselves. So even if central government doesn't foot the whole bill, at least having some guidance on this is how much. The sorts of funding approaches where one of the things we're doing in the team is we're funding part of a project EDS is doing. the Environmental Defence Society, of researching policy mechanisms. And I think you might have met Jonathan Boston yesterday, but he's doing this piece of work looking at funding. And he was running us through all of the options. Like, you can pay homeowners a flat rate regardless of the value of the property. You can pay them in proportion to the value of their property. You can pay the full value of their property. You can pay none of it. You can do it on a means-tested basis. So there are all of these, and I've seen other models like central or local government buying a property and allowing the homeowner to rent that property until such time as the property needs to be relocated. So there are, and examples from the Netherlands where the government pays full market rate for the property when the homeowner chooses to leave. So they devalue the property by changing the zoning, but will pay the pre-devaluation value when that homeowner leaves. So there are different mechanisms that have been proposed or that we've seen in other jurisdictions. So I guess we're kind of hoping that central government gives some guidance as to which one of those would be their preference for a model, or whether they're going to set a model, or whether they want each council to make that decision for themselves. And at the moment, they are very early days in their thinking. So I've got no indication from them as to where that might land. They're looking forward to the work of Jonathan Boston to give them a suite of policy options. So so that's kind of, so hence why you get that real range from Christchurch City Council going, in the absence of any clarity around how we should do that, we're just going to do an adaptation project that's solely about public assets. We're not doing anything about private assets right now. And that's how we're going to deal with this right now. And then you've got Northland, who are saying, we will do the discussion around private assets, but we're not going to resolve funding until later. And that holds the risk that you end up in a Muckra Beach situation again. But the Christchurch process doesn't deliver what people actually want either. So I think, so that's kind of what we're hoping you'll give us some feedback on. Because it's like, what would you recommend? Do we start dynamic adaptive pathway planning with communities with an open-ended, we don't know how this will be funded or what mechanisms we might use to fund it? Do we limit planning to just public assets? Or do we plan in two stages? So do one stage that's about the desirability and the technical, social and cultural feasibility, and then another process later that then incorporates funding mechanisms and economic feasibility. So, thoughts, I open it up for discussion. What would you like us to do?
Who would like to go first? Yep, Sarah.
Well, to some extent, I think the boat sailed and our communities are concerned. And, just saying we're only going to concentrate on public assets, I think will probably not be enough.
I think you're probably right.
And I think that actually there's a little bit of merit in the macro approach, even if it didn't get to the full conclusion, because it has highlighted. Look, people spoke so positively about it too. The macro community were actually really positive about the approach, and they may feel a bit disillusioned now that nothing's come of it. But at the time, they felt, I think, relieved that people were engaging in what was a big problem for them, and I quite like the Northland approach if it was done if we could do a little bit of that, because I think it's not till people start thinking about this problem and really thinking about what a massive challenge it could be that we have a lot more incentive to, one, to try and mitigate climate change, although we can only do our bit, and two, to actually start thinking creatively about how can we address this issue, and the sooner the better, really. The other big thing that's occurred to me is you can't really have two people opting out of when 16 people have agreed and two people stymie the whole thing. That's not really a good model. So somehow, and I think that's where central government actually has to make some rules about, do we actually have to have some mechanisms to somehow enforce it, and then it gets back to the Netherlands idea of how do you do that fairly? How do you actually make sure people have got the money, but how do you also make sure that that doesn't completely end up a gift, that there's some kind of responsibility eventually for them to do something like surrender their, I don't know. It's all, and in the middle of all of this, we've got to actually make sure we stay calm, because we do not actually want to undermine people's confidence in the city and our ability to actually work through some solutions. So it's a very thorny challenge.
And to stay calm when you have people who are quite rightly quite anxious.
Yeah.
You know, to
Of course they are.
stay calm in the face of people who are genuinely worried is, I think.
Yeah, but we do still have a little bit of time, but we don't have any time to delay, but we still do have a little bit of time to work through and find some solutions. So nothing is solved by panicking, and so I really emphasise that.
Jill.
It's very true. I was just thinking, in our local community, we've had some conversations around the stream, and I do think it is important that we do include, I guess, things where we would consider it to be a private landowner's responsibility, but so they're maybe losing land into the stream, but the designation of the stream corridor may have impacts on them through the district plan, and in future may, because of course the stream is widening in points, and so if we just take a purely kind of, well, that's your problem kind of approach, it doesn't allow communities to work together, doesn't help people plan and understand. I mean, there are some people who have said, look, if council were going to purchase our property, we might as well know soon, because then we will stop investing money in it. And I do think, particularly the Porirua stream, I really do wonder if there has been enough land left either side of the stream corridor to cope with the sort of water that we have going through there quite a lot at the moment. But of course, those are really tricky conversations for communities to have, and I feel like that collective is really important, so that we do get to the point where we don't have a couple of people kind of, really stuck in their position. And, at the moment, you can't really do any community planning around how to sort of, I guess, live in that area when that stream, or it could be on the coast, has huge impact on your daily life and how you access your property. But I do think we need to, I don't think we can just take the public kind of infrastructure view. I think that's not really fair, because at some point in the past these were consented properties, they were allowed to be built, and it does feel pretty rough for people to, obviously now you're in the situation where people are going to be sort of looking sideways at those sorts of things, and I think we just do need to be supporting and showing some community care for what is it's actually quite a few people in the city when you take the coastline and other waterways, because it's not just Tawa, there's also, as we've heard, there's through Ngaio, there's properties that are being affected. But yeah, I'd say we definitely need to include, people where we would just sort of go, oh, that's their problem. But actually we've impacted on that problem, we're continuing to.
Yeah. All right, Laurie, we should probably keep our comments. Yeah, and then Jenny. Yep. No, that's fine.
We've got till 11:30 to wrap this part up.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, yep.
I think one of the things we need to really push forward here is a culture of collectiveness, and that I think we quickly, when it doesn't concern us, and I think the makara, you've described it well, where there were the beachfront properties and then those on the hill, and then those on the hill went, nah, we're out of the pool on this. And I think as a city, we cannot start with that approach. We all enjoy, we need to come at it. We are together on this in some way. For me, I really like the Northland model. I think part of the problem here is it feels so overwhelming to people that where do you start? What does it look like? But if we can start to outline pathways, then I think everything is solvable if you feel like there's routes that you can start to go down. And so I'd also be interested in talking to the LGFA on a fund, maybe the Sustainability Fund or the Green Investment Fund could also put out cheaper rates to enable loans, and that we can support our community with that kind of service. I think that really provides positive pathways for people to start to investigate and feel like they can start to think about that over time. And in terms of the urgency, I think, yes, I think in one way we have got time, but not much. And I must say that just as a councillor, worrying about the Awhiaro community and these increase in swells is not something I want to sit around for much longer on.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks. I guess putting my Treasury hat on, I don't see how we can really it's very difficult to make decisions about what you spend, where, and what your priorities are when you don't know what the total amount is yet, and you don't know what all the options are. So it's very hard to prioritise. And then, I would also say that I think if you focus on the kind of attitude of who benefits and who pays, if you're going to invest public money, you would start with the things where the most people are benefiting, which is why I keep asking about the CBD adaptation, because what I don't want to do is have us go around the coastal communities and invest a whole lot of money and then be like, and the CBD, we're going to need a couple $2 billion to do that too. The CBD is the one where the whole city is invested. All of us are kind of on the line for the city, and I don't think that there's any reasonable proposals around a retreat of the city. Like, I think actually defence, at least for the next century, is probably where we're at. So we need to understand what that means. What are the options? What is it going to cost? And I actually think that has to be financially the first cab off the rank, because that is the one that affects everyone in the city and in the region, because we're the economic hub of the whole region. I think that it is still worth doing dynamic adaptive planning with local communities in that context, because I think it helps us understand the scale of the problem and the costs that are involved. And at the moment, without it, we don't know what the costs are. But I think it would have to go ahead on the basis of there is no commitment to any funding at this point, because we actually don't know. But I do think that, as much as the Mākara community might be very unhappy with the result because there actually hasn't been anything built, they have a lot more information as private landowners about the costs that they are facing and the decisions that they need to make. And that might be very uncomfortable. I'm sure it is very uncomfortable, but it is also useful.
And I find that community so fascinating, because they've built houses that are batches next to a beach at a river mouth, with strong hills that funnel strong water down that river, and it's kind of it's a fascinating place to try to be permanent in.
Yeah, and I guess my reaction to the Mākara is, from a financial standpoint, 50-50 was very generous from the council's point of view, because I think if we come back to who benefits, who pays, I think there is probably some city-wide benefit to being able to continue to use that coastline, and people like to visit and whatnot, but actually in that community, primarily the benefit is public and captured entirely by that community. So actually 50-50,
Generous.
Probably too generous in my view. There's no way we could go across more communities, across the whole city, saying 50-50. Again, with my Treasury hat on, that's just not financially feasible. But I think we have put that community in a situation where they kind of understand what their options are, and I think that's actually the goal of dynamic adaptive planning, in my view. It's not to build a seawall or, to build something. It's to get a plan and better understanding. So, when the sea level rises by 5 centimetres, we can do A or we can do B, and A costs this much and B costs that much. And then when we get to 5 centimetres, we know how we make that decision and who's going to make it and how it'll be paid for. And then we know that when the sea level gets to 20 centimetres, we could do X or we could do Y.
Yep.
And we know roughly what the costs are of either of those options. It's not about making decisions now necessarily, and I think that's really an issue about managing community expectations, because the community expects, if we go in and have a conversation, they expect something to happen. And I think actually that's not what dynamic adaptive planning is about.
I think that's been something that I've really struggled with, is that gap between what communities expect when you start one of these processes and what you're actually delivering, and needing to be very clear up front. Sean gave me a great insight where he said, you're not solving a problem, you're not fixing it, you're creating flexibility of future options. And to keep your eye on that, and to be very clear about that also in the framing of how you enter this conversation, because it's not like it's solvable
And yeah, we had a great session with Mataho Aranui about a te o Māori way of seeing climate change and extreme weather and sea level rise. And they view it more as Tangaroa kind of coming in and taking space from Papatauanuki, and them having kind of a bit of a jostling, and us needing to, take accountability for our role in creating that tension between them and supporting that.
Yeah, and that's why I do come back to Jill's point about at some point all of these private dwellings were consented, so we do have responsibility. So that's where I kind of get to the kind of 15%. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we do have, as a council, we do have to have some skin in the game, but again, my gut feeling is 50% probably, is not going to be feasible across the whole city.
But also, I guess it's the expertise that council can provide that also helps people as well, isn't it? So the money is important, but it's also the planning and the way that you work it through.
Yes,
absolutely.
Except I went through the island-based seawall. I don't agree with, I get what you're saying, but I actually don't agree. I think you need to bring money to the table or a financial solution. There's no point. We spent all this time going through, and then we were just like, oh, this is too expensive to do actually what was the most sensible solution, although we didn't have...
Totally agree. I guess the planning is the bit where people get stuck.
Yeah, we can accept. And so what I would suggest, Alison, is that all of those funding mechanisms, we know what they are a lot of the time, are on the table. I'd also say equity is a major issue, because actually some people have done more to cause climate change than other people. So that's where, like if you've got, like if you're doing it on a rating basis where people in higher value properties tend to have more cash, you see there is a way of making it a little bit fairer. The other thing is I'm going to put you in touch with the people who own earthquake-prone buildings, because this is exactly the same conversation. The government has put 100% responsibility, except putting a few, $1,000 here and there, and it's not working. Like, it is failing because people can't afford it, and we're not talking about 20,000, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I've challenged this council many times on this and the government. So I think it would be good to kind of be able to navigate those, and remembering at the same time we're dealing with climate change, we will probably have earthquakes coming in as well, which will be another cost. Hopefully they'll bring the land up, but as I've said, that's not a great adaptation strategy. Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I just had a couple of more comments before we move on. I guess one of the things I would think about, Island Bay being quite a different community to Makara, where there's much more investment, more houses, probably more infrastructure. We've got a public road between the sea and the private houses. So all of that then brings in other issues about, and again, I think you come back to the question of who benefits, who pays, right? There is a benefit to the whole city for having that road there. There's a benefit to the whole suburb to having that road there. But if we defend the road, the private owners behind the road also gain significant benefit. So it's again about, you have to look at what are the, how do you start thinking about those questions about who benefits and who pays. The only thing I would come back to is Jill's point just about, I think we focus a lot on coastal, and I think we need to frame it more as living with water, which is how they frame it. And I guess that comes back to, we're talking about Te Ao Māori with Tangaroa kind of coming back in. It's about, in the Netherlands, that's how they frame it. It's about how do we live with more water. That brings in slips.
We're going to have a lot of waterfalls.
It brings in the Porirua stream, which we know in our community we've got property owners who are really more stuck probably than people who are living in a Whera Bay at the moment. So, it brings in those communities as well, which I think is really important, because I think it's easy for us to think about the coast because we're always thinking about sea level rise, but I think it needs to be more about living with water and what that means across the whole city.
Our areas of inland flooding are quite significant.
Yeah. And also, I guess I just think about it from the point of view of being a Northern Ward councillor, where there's a very, we don't actually have any coastline in the Northern Ward. We're the only ward in the city that doesn't have coastline. And so there is a potential in terms of everyone being in it together. There would be a potential for people living in the Northern Ward to go, not my problem. But I think if we reframe this as about it's living with water, water falls everywhere. We have streams, the stream running through.
If you put each side of the stream together, it's a very long line.
It's a lot of
and
coastline.
You've got lots of hills as well. So
if you look at that, you just stream.
Struggling to access their properties to get to their homes.
They can't get to their home.
Probably even a different challenge
Yeah.
to our coastal one at the moment.
So yeah, I think that kind of might help shift and reframe it for some of those communities that are like, I don't live on the coast. I'm fine, thanks.
Flooding in the street, is that because?
Yeah, so there's stream. Yeah, it's again slips, and then stream issues where, particularly through Tawa and
Some
parts of
people
Glen-
had to climb across fallen down trees to get across the stream to get out of their property.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got
Yeah,
properties in
yeah.
Niall and Tawa where people, the street is on one side, then the stream, then the house. So they actually, we've got people who, as Jill is saying, actually are having trouble getting access from the street to their home right now.
I think that's
Okay, right. Should we move on to the next? Because
so
this
if
is
I
a
just
big
want to
topic.
wrap
Oh,
up
and
that.
sorry, Terry. Sorry, Terry. I've just seen your hand up. Do you want to make a quick comment?
Just very briefly, which was to make a note around our Pacifica communities and how we are folding them into all of this. We've got a very large Pacifica community here in Wellington that are being affected and hit disproportionately the most by climate change at the moment, and their islands back home, and have contributed very little to climate change. So I would just put that on the table around our collective framing to kind of extend that to our neighbours, but certainly when we're coming up with communities of interest and collectivism, I think we should have a Pacifica voice in there, consistent and on those stages. So if we're taking different perspectives on, I'd really encourage that the representation of Pacifica people.
Good point.
Okay, thank you. Great feedback on funding. I think we've got enough to go on for now. To some extent, this comes down to who decides and who pays, and the who pays is arguably the harder piece because, like you've pointed out, Councillor Pennant, it's not always done in a way that we would see as fair, or there are always people who are going to be poorly affected by that. We're now going to move on to a bit of who decides.
The easy bit, right?
Which I think is a bit easier because we can go, well, this is the framework by which we're going to decide these things, and this is how we're going to structure it.
Thank you. You can go through to the next one. Excellent. So this is really getting into how do we plan community by community? How do we do this at scale? How do we roll out the DAP approach? Which we know, there's more and more councils who are, I guess, even in the context of the funding uncertainty, are also reaching out to communities to do DAP planning with their communities. So that means that, we can build on the experiences of other councils as well, which is great. But I guess what we're proposing is that, so we'll be using the DAP approach to work with high-risk communities to develop plans, and that we can begin, I guess, piloting the approach with high-risk communities. But we really recognise that we need to interface with the citywide planning, so very much thinking about how do we roll out adaptation planning across the whole municipality. And I'd put that target of we would develop plans with 100% of high-risk areas by 2030, and I've already heard that that's too long, so that's good feedback.
And look, it was in highlighted
exactly.
yellow.
I knew that it would be too long. Thanks, Alison.
So this is what we've said in the Te Atakura updates. That just summarises that, yes, we're going to do community planning, but we have left it in this update obviously quite open-ended because we haven't yet developed our approach or our roadmap.
Yeah. Thank you. So, we know that, what we're hoping to do is to build a program that is going to be a more equitable approach, but really bringing communities at the centre of the process. So we know that involving communities early throughout the process is going to be really important. And the feedback that that we're getting as part of this workshop today is really helpful in helping us kind of frame how we do that in the process. But we're also doing that in the context of trying to figure out how do we do this at scale. So there are a number of different, I guess, things that we can work through to try and prioritise who we would work with first, and the findings of the climate change impact assessment that we're working on at the moment will be really useful in providing an evidence base for how we would define who are the highest risk areas. So there's a number of different criteria that we could use to look at risk over time, and make sure that we're prioritising our efforts and working at a pace that's going to be reflective of the risk that we face in Wellington. And so depending on the context of the areas for adaptation that are prioritised, we would then create an engagement process that would be tailored to the the uniqueness of each community area. So depending on if it's a tiny community, something more like Makura, versus maybe the communities along the south coast, or in communities in Tawa, we would approach that differently in our engagement planning, and we'd need to, resource that differently. But we would use a common approach, so that's where the DAP wheel is really, really helpful. So regardless of the complexities of the communities, we're still going through that standard process. So we'll have standard things like the types of categories of options that we would present. So Alison was talking about these earlier. So, do we do nothing? Do we accommodate? Do we protect, avoid, or plan to relocate? For example, Christchurch City Council have developed a guideline with, it's like a menu of standard adaptation options that they use in their approach. And so we're also proposing that we'd need some common sets of principles to guide us through the approach. So again, these principles on the screen I borrowed from Christchurch City Council for their optioneering phase of the DAP approach. So they use effectiveness, feasibility, sustainability, and meeting all of the other guiding principles as how they select which options would be prioritised within the DAP process. So that leads us to a little activity so one thing that we're really wanting some feedback from you all on today is the really, really important guiding principles for our adaptation planning. So we've prepared a little activity, and so essentially what we're going to do is ask you to prioritise and reflect on what you think are the most important principles for the Wellington context. So we've brought together principles from various frameworks, so from the IPCC, the National Adaptation Plan, the MFE Coastal Hazards Guidance, and we've also presented the content of when we went through a similar exercise with a whole bunch of council officers a few months ago to get your feedback on what you think is really, really important for the Wellington context. So we've got two different versions because we've got online people and we've got the in-the-room version.
So you're going to put a Miro link for...
Yeah, there is a Miro link, which I think Eddie will send to those online. But it's a simple exercise. It's essentially just a sticky dot voting exercise. So what we're going to do is break out into two groups here in the room. And how many?
And just to preface that, I've clearly heard from this council many times that social equity and mana whenua are things that are extremely important to this council and to this city. So you can take those as given, but feel free to dot the crap out of them on the board as well. But there are a variety of other principles up there from those 3 frameworks and from that officer workshop. So just have a peruse, and if any of them sing out to you and you're like, oh, that one's particularly well expressed, or I like the sound of that one, stick a dot on it. Where are the dots?
Can I ask a question on that? Because I'd quite like to put my dots on other things and just trust that you're going to get those things well and truly in there. But I just want to make sure that if I don't put them on there, that you still, keep that there. So it just
you don't have to waste your dots on social equity or mana whenua.
Because that will be there. Because then it's more useful.
Right.
It's actually more useful for us to guide the other parts.
Dot for the other things. Yeah, assume those 2 things are there.
Cool.
I
trust.
Cool.
Yep.
And I presume we will keep focusing on stopping climate change in the first place, and we'll stop having arguments about cycleways. That will be my Christmas present. There you go. Right, good.
I've been thinking about dynamic adaptive planning.
into the next two conversations down, two more to go. So this one is about getting your feedback on how we centre community voices when we're doing this work.
Yeah. So I thought it might be helpful to look at some other case studies to see what other councils are also doing in this space. I know that we have learnt a lot here in Wellington, but there's also some interesting work emerging around the country as well. So the first so I've picked a few case studies that really focus on community participation in the process. This first one is the Takatai Kapiti case study, and they're really just kind of kicking off a lot of their engagement in the last few months. But one thing that I think is really has a lot of things that we can learn from is their multi-party working group, where they have various people from the community come together with technical experts in a process to work through adaptation planning collectively. So they've broken the coastline up into 5 different adaptation areas, and you'll see on the next slide that they've got a work program. I know it's a bit messy, but I quite like it, that essentially is working through strategically all of those adaptation areas at a staggered time frame. So there's a bit of efficiency to their process as well, but really interesting from a community-led adaptation planning perspective. Lots of really meaningful opportunities for mana whenua and for communities to come together in a process to try and identify options. A couple of other examples of how other councils are setting up structures to support community participation in the adaptation decision making. You'll see a lot of common themes here. So the example on the left is from Christchurch City Council, where they have a very similar approach, having set up, so they have the coastal panel, which has representatives from the community of each of the areas, and that sits alongside the STAG, so the Specialist and Technical Advisory Group. So
That's very unfortunate. Please don't.
we'll change the name. Won't use that name. So there is this a process for communities to participate in the process, and that it's supported by good technical information as well. The case study on the right is from the Hauraki District Council and together with the Waikato Regional Council, and you'll be able to see this much better when we send the slides out, but they have a whole process that really articulates who in the decision-making process and when is involved in what types of decisions. So they explain how the community panel comes together and makes decisions with council within the council processes and alongside the technical experts as well.
Yeah, I quite like that one because it's easy to explain to people what's going on and when their contribution is going to be considered, and that it's coming back to them later.
Yeah.
So I quite like the clarity of that one too.
And so having those kind of structures in place really helps us to be able to deliver on more of an equitable approach that we can do at scale. And I think we've been really well recognised for the work that was done in Makara. There's obviously a lot of similarities in how the project was established, having community representation sit alongside the technical experts. So again, lots of really good work that we can learn from, but I guess our challenge now is how do we do that at scale for the city in the timeframes that we're facing. So you can
And we'll get to a resourcing conversation later around how much these processes cost.
Yeah. And again,
Mana whenua and governance.
yes. So looking at what other councils are doing in terms of how they're bringing mana whenua into the governance structure for adaptation, there's quite a wide variety of different approaches. And this would be something we'd be looking for your feedback and guidance on. But Auckland, for example, there's a Kaitiaki forum. I believe there's 19 iwi, I think, there that come together in the forum. Kapiti Coast, they have a partnership agreement. Mana whenua have been deeply involved in the design of the Takatai Kapiti program. They've been, I think it's 6 representatives on the community panel have been selected by Mana whenua. But yeah, there's a range of different ways that mana whenua can be brought into governance processes, and I guess for us it's about how do we do that well for the Wellington context and bring mana whenua into the model for Wellington. Do you want to move to the next one? So this is another straw man proposal for this multi-party working group type arrangement where we'd be looking to establish some collective decision-making structures. So to set up processes that would allow us to work with mana whenua and the community alongside technical advice. And so there's I think the clearest piece is the technical advisory group. We would be proposing that would be made up of representatives from mana whenua. There'd be various kind of technical advisors from planning and engineering and the PSR team. We'd bring together other agencies so that we'd be working collaboratively across the region, so agencies like DOC or Waka Kotahi, and that, we'd be doing this together with the Regional Council and Wellington Water. So they would be providing advice to the Community Advisory Panel, which would be made up of representatives from the affected community. So depending on where those how we scope those adaptation areas, that would be reflected in the model. And the feedback or the advice and recommendations would be provided through to a governance group to make decisions, for example, on funding. And so there would be a governance group that would oversee the implementation of the project. And so that would be representatives from mana whenua, Wellington City and Greater Wellington City, Regional Council, and potentially some other stakeholders. So this is very much just a concept and something that we would invite your feedback on. Please.
Thanks. I guess just kind of being a bit sceptical and putting my devil's advocate hat on, my question would be, what does the Community Advisory Panel add? Because my concern would be that it's simply adding an extra layer of bureaucracy. So I would be kind of asking, what is it going to add and contribute over and above the governance group? And how is it different to the governance group? I think we would just have to justify that quite strongly, because we don't just want.
This is a fairly common structure where you've got the technical advisory group meeting separately to hash out the engineering conversations and the ecology conversations, and then bringing their consolidated point of view to the community advisory panel. So the community advisory panel is like the community have worked through their values and what they, the social elements and cultural elements of what they value about that particular area, what they would like to see. And then you add here's what's possible, and then that community advisory panel is developing the actual pathway forward. So it's you've got working groups on the social, the cultural, the ecology, the economics, the technical, and then they all come together in that advisory panel to design a pathway. And then you've got multiple local adaptation pathways being passed through to the governance group, to your point, to being able to compare and contrast, prioritise, and decide, what elements of which pathways go first, kind of piece. So you'd have multiple community advisory panels representing each area, all developing local adaptation plans with officer support, and then those plans go through to the governance group. You could have those plans going through to council, but given that the funding for the plans is probably spread across Greater Wellington, Wellington Water, Council, and you would want mana whenua representation in that decision as well. So, yeah, that's why we've called it a governance group as opposed to just council, because you're trying to get agreement on funding. Did I represent that right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, so Terry, Laurie, Sarah.
And we don't really have an attachment to this, right? So if you want to rip it apart and say, actually, you've got all of the boxes in the wrong place, could you please do more like this other one? Or if you think about it later and you're like, actually, we don't like it, do it a different way, that is completely fine. So we mean it when we put a little straw person there on the slide.
Tear it apart.
Okay, no, it doesn't need to be constructive feedback. Terry.
The stuffing.
I do just have a couple of queries about this. Mostly it's around, and Jenny used the word layer bureaucracy, but I guess if I was a member of the public looking in to be like, understanding what we're doing about climate change, communities represented here in the form of many of the boxes, but I guess if I'm going to be deciding what to put my time and effort into, I might only have the ability to engage with the panel once, or the community or the councillors once. So it's just about, for me, where would I be engaging and how can I be assured that my perspective's been taken on? Because also in my perspective, Wellington City councillors and Greater Wellington City councillors are representatives of the community panel, and just kind of being a bit of an naysayer there. It's just having those really clear delineations. And then also, if this is a multi-party working group, if Greater Wellington Regional Council, what have their climate responses been, and how much buy-in do they have? Because I know in the past we've tried to work with them on ecology and stuff, and they've been a part of it, and then they've just dropped out at the end because they don't want to fund it. But yeah, so it's for just the negative, but
if I'm to flip those around into pieces of advice, it would be, I'm going to paraphrase and you can tell me if I'm right. It would be ensure that there is strong facilitation so that the participation across the other agencies is maintained and goes somewhere at the end. Because I think often those things come to a grinding halt because people stop facilitating them or stop having ownership of them. So it would be Wellington City Council officers' accountability to make sure that it is facilitated, turned into a pathway, delivered at the end. And I mean, you develop a pathway, but it's not it's not the end of the conversation, because the pathway then becomes the framework under which you have continuous conversation as triggers come up. So does that sound about right?
Yeah. I guess my nightmare is that we will end up with lots of reports and then people will be arguing over whose report is better or more valid because we said this or that, or this is more progressive. So just figuring out how we can see that through, and you reduce the governance stuff as well, which is great. Thank you, Alison.
Cool. Laurie. Thanks.
Just a couple of thoughts. Just the way the regional growth governance group is working, linking into government. So I guess can we have a link? Is there a possibility to link into central government with one of the ministers being on the governance group, for example? Just looking at the way that's been shaped. And the other one, and Tam, I hope you don't mind me jumping in, but Tam raised yesterday was even within our own council officers that we've got seniority as part of this group. And so would council officers be involved in the specialist and technical advisory group, for example? Possibility.
Yes. You mean could councillors be involved in the?
No, officers. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got officers as involved in the technical group.
Right. Yes.
Yep.
So I think Tam raised it yesterday about seniority of officers as well. Because.
So you've got buy-in from the whole organisation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean the advisory group and the community group. And this kind of this speaks a little bit to Terry's question before. That's where the research work and the discussion happens, and then the community advisory panel is how do we sort that out into an actual pathway? So how do we? So that's where you would want the senior people who can make decisions to be in that discussion to kind of work out what the pathway looks like and help guide that decision making on what the pathways that would be recommended. Mm-hmm. And then the governance group is obviously that seniority above that, where it's are we going to fund it or not?
Yeah, cool.
Or are we going to fund elements of it, or in what order? And in what way? Blah, blah, blah.
Great.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Good feedback.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I have a little bit of sympathy with Jenny's comment that it does seem to be a bit of a double up, perhaps for me it's having a community and a community advisory panel. I just wonder if we jump straight to the community advisory panel at stage at the top there. But also we're asking a lot of mana whenua, and I know they will need, they must be involved. But I wonder how they would respond to the workload that this would indicate, especially if there are multiple projects going on at different places around the city.
Except it's very important for them. They've said this.
Yeah, true. Okay, well, I mean, it's just a comment, just to make sure we don't overburden them.
No, that's good feedback. I think we've probably misnamed the community advisory panel. It's more like that is the multi-working group. They don't get called that in general in other processes, but it would be more than the community. It's the merging of that community working group and the technical advisory working group. It's it's the meeting structure where they come together and hash it out.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That helps. Yep.
Could I just make the point, I guess it would fit in maybe with the community or the technical, but we need some of the key city stakeholders. So the airport has to be dragged to the table still. And the property council, for example. So I guess I would have thought this multi-party working group would be the place that you bring some community, but you actually do bring some of those people who we can't succeed without. And look, I've talked to Eugene about because I'm philosophically really more democratic. I'd rather that actually right from the beginning the community were going away and even given a bit of resource to think about how this will actually work, who needs to be around the table, who's going to be, what are some of the parameters. And then once that's set up really well, take some time to do that well, then hopefully you can work much faster to actually do things. Because I'm a bit sceptical about the governance group, I'm sorry. I mean, it feels a bit distant when all of us have got a massive stake in seeing this piece of work succeed. So I'd rather maybe you bring the multi-party working group and the governance group together too, supported by a technical group might be more my preference. Keep the numbers down and then be quite careful about that people who come onto a group are prepared to do some work, right, and have some particular expertise or represent a particular area. And then, of course, mana whenua, so Karapa sort of said to me, we'll hold a space. So I guess Jill and Tam and can advise on, how that space is held. Jill.
I'm just wondering how we also deal with, like, for the community advisory panel or whatever it is, anyone who's putting time in from the community, do we pay them? Because obviously they're bringing
might need to.
expertise and, we'll be expecting a bit of commitment. I think sometimes that just really shows that we respect that, and that, I think it is quite important to
Be a lot of work.
respect people's time, and it indicates to people that it will be a commitment, because otherwise people can kind of think, oh, well, it's just that little thing that I do back there, but it's like, actually, it's a really big kaupapa, and we want people to spend that time doing the reading and
consulting with people in their community or whatever.
Actually being out in the community and seeing their role is to talk to people about it that they know, because they will generally be community leaders. So.
And just my last point is to reflect on what we've done well in the past and where we need to improve. So Eugene and I talked about the water task force, what was really good, what you might change. So and all we've talked about Makara, we've talked about Island Bay, because that is my fear too, that we just do end up with a whole lot of work done and then it just stops and we've just got this massive report and we're sitting around going,
well, that is one of the things that we're
action.
flagging with you, is that we will develop these dynamic adaptive pathways and they will exist and they will have dollar signs on them, and then we will not know how to fund them.
So no, which is why that's going to be a critical part.
Too high, right? For local ratepayers to fund the full cost, it will be too high. We definitely know that.
Yep.
So that's why we're here having this conversation with you, because we're going to start embarking on these conversations, and we can raise community awareness. We can help communities work through understanding what the impacts are, understanding what the options are, understanding those options over time and the flexibility. But we will end up with processes that finish with a fully developed pathway and no commitment to fund it.
So that's why this group actually needs to, right from the start, to get started on the funding options. We see, the Northland approach is that the discussion of funding options is in the conversation in terms of preferred structures or preferred mechanisms, but it's the being able to commit to actually spending the money at the end. We needed a process that involves central government coming to the party with how much they are going to be prepared to commit and in what format and what those funding mechanisms will look like, a discussion at this table around what council is willing to commit to, and a discussion that's held through this process around what individuals are willing to commit to, plus the insurance company. So all of those parties need to be involved in that funding conversation, and that's bigger than any one adaptation process. So this is a straw person structure for a local community process to deliver it. What we aren't discussing, what we don't have a straw person for is the how we're going to have that conversation with central government on funding allocation, or the rates policy, if you like, because central government haven't finished their policy work on their funding and financing mechanisms. Well, we can do our bit because we know what the tools that we've got. Getting the insurers around the table is going to be really hard. They don't want to talk. The Insurance Council will come, but not the actual insurers. Jenny?
Thanks. I guess just following on from one of your comments, Alison, is a bit of confusion about what the community advisory panel is. Is it kind of like a Whaitua task force thing where people sign up to be a member of it for 6 months and they write the report? Or are we talking about, you kind of talked about it as like a forum, like for discussion and decision. So is it actually just a place where the community and the technical advisory group and possibly some people from governance actually come together to have conversations in a kind of participative process? That's kind of where I'm confused, and I think they're quite different things. The idea that we kind of have an open process where people from governance and TAG and anyone from the community can come, and we have a facilitated participative process, is different to we have a Whaitua committee that has membership and comes along. So that's
I think that's really good feedback, and I think we'll take that away to think about, because I see that yellow box as where the work gets done for developing the pathway. So at the end of that process, you have a pathway, but ways to skin a cat.
Yes.
Do you have a point of view, or do you want more time to think about it?
I think you raise a really good point around, and I've heard it in a lot of comments around how do we make this genuinely inclusive to people and make it genuinely participatory. So I really like that idea of the yellow box being a forum where we can bring in the right people at the right time to be able to make the decisions. We'll go away and do a bit more thinking, I think.
Yeah, I guess one of my thoughts when I was looking at it is when we set up a group like that, who does it exclude?
Yeah.
You know, because if you're setting up like a whaitua and you've got a list of membership, like by definition, only the membership can show up, right? So it's thinking about those processes as well.
I mean, I would always lean to a more open and democratic process, but then there's the question of paying people for their participation in their time, and sort of how you combine those two things. And what I liked about the Makara Beach process was there was over time, there was a real consistency to who came, and so you had them really understanding the phase before or the meeting before and turning up and understanding it again. So you're not needing to, I guess, cope with different people, floating in and out of the process. But it was a small number of households, so it's relatively easier to manage.
Jill, and then Sarah.
I think if you're going to do something that's more inclusive and have more people, then there will have to be some intentional shoulder tapping to make sure that, because generally if it's people putting themselves forward, we will get the same communities being represented that we currently have. So there needs to be some intentional connections into the community, and councillors can probably help with various community groups that you could go to kind of think about how you get that diversity, because I think diversity of thought is really important in these processes, because often the people who naturally come to it actually sometimes have some quite fixed views when they start, and it's quite good to have people coming in who are kind of like, oh, this does matter to me, but I haven't done lots of research and I'm coming to it quite fresh, which is really important. I think that's quite helpful. And if you're wanting to think about how to the payment side of things, another way, if you did want a slightly wider group, would be feed people, and then at the end you might have a process whereby people who have attended a significant number of whatever it is, whether they get a voucher or something, just something that says thank you, we really are koha, as a way of managing if you want a larger group. But yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of prefer the more diverse kind of you get a slightly different level of creativity with that kind of approach.
And it does, I agree with you on shoulder tapping, because you do need to make sure you've got a representative group from the particular area you're doing a local adaptation plan for, and you want to make sure the quieter voices are heard.
Because I think often the people who come forward first are already being heard. It's the other people who will be like, well, we are affected, but we know we've got to wait our turn, or but actually we do want to hear from people who are.
And this is my favourite part of the adaptation work, actually, is that this is the creation of safe spaces for people to go through their journeys of understanding that there's risk to their home, which is a really tough journey for people to go on, and the privilege of being able to hold those people through that process. And everyone who lives in that community needs to be held through that process, not just people who might be more extroverted or more happy to be heard.
Cool. Okay, so Sarah, Laurie, and then we've got someone on screen.
Yeah, my point was just that if you can you can help with the terms of reference. So if you have a very small group, maybe the terms of reference are that they need to go to the community and report and collect feedback on a more regular basis. But if you have a larger group, maybe that's not so needed. So so just that balance in the terms of reference that tie up with the size and composition of the group.
And to Jamuna's earlier point around different sizes of communities or different levels of complexity, you might choose different processes, so you might design it in different ways
So a smaller community would be easier to quickly hear from everyone. A larger community, you'd have to be more thoughtful about who was in the room and how you were making sure you got a wide variety of different points of view. So it would definitely be, thank you. So it's good feedback that there are different models we could investigate on doing that participation. I think.
And it might not be a one size fits all either. If you're thinking, this could be for various different communities, it might be quite different.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Laurie, then Silas.
Can't express how important a great facilitators are, and I know that we will, but I just can't support that enough. That's all I need to say. I'm only going to say that once, which means it's really important.
That is a good point. Thank you, Silas.
Hey, so we had mentioned that we know for sure mana whenua are interested in this. Do we know any of the specifics on how involved each of our mana whenua partners would like to be involved in the project?
Thanks for the question. We have had a number of opportunities to talk with mana whenua about climate change projects that Council is working on generally. There are a number of projects that kind of feed into this one, where we've had a few more active discussions on, but we haven't gone to mana whenua yet about this proposal because it's so early days for Council. Jill?
I could suggest it's a really good time because we were actually talking with mana whenua leaders on Friday, and the health of the Porirua harbour came up, and obviously very aware that the Porirua stream is actually a really big problem for the Porirua harbour, and they were very interested. So I would say really soon is a good time to talk with them, because I think it would actually be quite interesting to shape it through that lens. I mean, Liz Kelly shared with me at a meeting just about how some of the historical issues that have come up over the stream over years, that it was straightened, and just, some of the things that have happened from industrial areas, they've got a long history, which I think can really help community engage with it and understand why we are where we are. I mean, I had no idea that part of the reason we have a problem in Tawa is because the stream isn't doing what it wanted to do. It's been channeled through, and that's why some properties, it is grumpy. It's trying to find its own pathway, and so many streams in our country are doing this. But when it's going through your very well-developed community, and little pockets of the community are having quite different experiences, I do think that it would be quite good to work with mana whenua on that one.
And also, if I can just chip in from that meeting, apparently with the Better Off funding, we are meant to be working with mana whenua. And I don't know, Jill, you probably heard that as well.
Oh, I think that was going to be followed up.
Yeah.
Just that we should have, there should have been engagement before we were agreeing to it. So
But at least even if we can't do that step now, we can make sure that we...
I think we're going to have to. So that's probably just a heads up, because I think it could actually affect its our success at the point where it's judged at DIA. They'll be like, "Did you work with mana whenua?" And when mana whenua says, "We didn't really know about this."
Good to know, because we're going to both the Ngāti Toa hui and the Taranaki Whānui hui today and tomorrow to talk about the climate action campaign, behaviour change, community engagement work. So we'll be able to bring that up.
Jill, can I just ask a quick question? I mean, I keep saying to Eugene, mana whenua are not community members, they're decision makers, treaty partners, so I just wonder...
They're both.
Yeah. So just about how, again, you made the point about resourcing, about just how we make sure that that happens, and it does need to happen now, not 6 months' time.
So just to cover off some of the conversations we've had with mana whenua to date, we have briefed them on the Bloomberg project, which we want their input on, and they are reasonably interested in the proposal that that's open source and that they could use that tool for their own purposes with their communities and in their own way. We also, my sense is that the most efficient use of mana whenua engagement and input would be through the Regional Leadership Committee projects, both the Regional Impact Assessment and the Regional Emissions Reduction Plan, because then instead of them trying to stretch themselves, like Ngāti Toa has 14 TAs within its rohe, so instead of them trying to integrate with everything, that regional leadership committee, the impact assessment is the first part of that project that then leads into regional adaptation planning, and it's just a way for them to really maximise the impact of their involvement and their input. And what I'm trying to focus on with mana whenua engagement is building their level of trust, that we understand their point of view, that we understand what the outcomes are that they want to achieve, and that they trust us that we are bringing that point of view to the work, and that it's an open door that they can be involved whenever they like, and that we will pay for their participation. So it's a way of kind of recognising both the value of their input and their role as a treaty partner, but without the expectation that they can send somebody to every community panel, every special advisory technical group, and every governance group meeting that we hold, because there'll be multiple local adaptation plans across the city, plus we want their input on the overall city's adaptation plan, and we're only one of the 14 councils. So trying to make it, I guess, efficient for them and powerful for them and impactful for them, but also in a way that leaves the door open that if they did want to resource up, we can help pay for that. If they did want to throw 100 people at it, they can throw 100 people at it. So,
Yeah, I mean,
any feedback you have on that kind of approach. We're also working very closely with Mataho, Aranui and Karapa to make sure that however we approach this is in alignment with Takahere, with our tenure Māori strategy, with the relationships that they're building with mana whenua. They've been all over the presentations that I'm delivering to the tūhui and making sure that I'm very clear on protocol and...
I guess the big piece of feedback I give is that at the moment, I know that they're actually going, Ngāti Toa are going over to Australia to catch up with whānau over there. One of the things I think they're really thinking about is how they bring people back, and there is work here. But I guess the challenge is where we drip feed and say you can participate here, you could participate here, and it's kind of like it's not really a job. So how do you get your whānau to come and engage with this if it's not really a job? So I think we probably do need to think about what we can do to resource up so that they actually can put people into jobs where they know this person actually will have the time and the capacity to deal with this. Otherwise, they've actually got their normal number of people who are just trying to stretch themselves a bit thinner because it's only a couple of hours here and there. So I think if we could try and work out how much we think that would look like at a regional level, I mean, that might be 4 or 5 people. It might be quite a few people, but I think, and within that, there will be particular parts that they will want a lot of involvement. Like I'm pretty sure where Porirua Harbour is part of the discussion, they will want to be involved in probably most of the meetings, because that is where they will be really, I guess, really affected, and there'll be parts of the top of the South Island as well. So whereas there'll be parts of Wellington where they'll be like, okay, well, Te Atiawa Taranaki whānui, we're happy to leave them to it a little bit, so there will be a bit of that to work out as well, and they may want to work together a little bit as well. But I do think the big thing that I'm seeing is that it's really hard to just keep kind of stretching individuals. It's like actually if they knew that in a year's time they could be employing 5 more people and there would be the resource and funding there, then that's where we'll start to see a really big jump.
Level of engagement.
Yeah.
That's really good feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think as a region we could fund that. Like we have to have that conversation as a region. Like, what will Wellington be looking at utilising time-wise and all of them? And if you put it together and you're like, actually, Ngāti Toa can probably employ 5 people, Te Atiawa probably the same, whatever. But that, I reckon that would be pretty phenomenal, and it would put them in a really good position to be able to participate. Yeah.
That's good. Are we nearly finished in time to wrap up and talk about next steps, or have you got some?
Next steps and resourcing. So does anybody have any more comments on this kind of straw person? I feel like you've thoroughly bashed it up. This is good.
Well, so we all talk about the next steps, what to do with that model now.
Next steps. Yep, we're going to next steps right now. So we're just going to talk through what we think we might do. So the parts that we know we can do and that we are resourced to do is raising awareness of risks. We've got the Bloomberg project. It's a good way of involving people. Did you want to say anything about that?
Maybe I'll talk about it on the next slide. Yeah. Yeah, I think in terms of the Bloomberg project, so in the next 6 months, we're really in the beginning phases of setting up the project properly. But part of what we'll be working on is developing the partnership with Mana Whenua. So we have a contractor who's come on board from Mapuna, who's developing a engagement framework for how we can work with Mana Whenua on the project, which lasts for 3 years. So we need to think, to your points about how do we structure our work to make it as easy as possible and as impactful as possible for Mana Whenua. So that's kind of the first piece of work that we're doing. But at the same time, we're also thinking about how do we co-design this digital tool with the community. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to work with we know the residents in the South Coast are very interested to start working with us on the tool, which will be a great opportunity. But we'll be looking to develop an engagement plan to make sure that we're getting good inclusive representation in the design of the tool as well. So great.
Sorry,
question.
what Councillor Free just asked is, what does the tool involve?
Yep.
Sorry, there are
What's it
people on-
planned to achieve? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have the funding from Bloomberg to design a digital tool to support us with adaptation planning. So one thing that we know that will build into the tool will be the risk awareness piece. So we'll be able to show in a very kind of realistic way, for example, what sea level rise could look like on the city. But how we design and deliver this in a way that's helpful to decision making and helpful to communities has a lot of nuances to doing that, because we don't want to just scare people. And so in addition to being able to showing the risks, we're also building a tool that can help us to come up with some solutions. So we're not entirely sure exactly all the details yet, and that's the point of co-designing the tool with Mana Whenua and with community.
It's also why it costs $1 million US, because you have to work to do the tool, but also the process to figure out what we can use it for, what's feasible, what information can you put into it, how interactive can you make it or can't you, so what's technically possible, what's useful from a community perspective. So we're kind of early stages of figuring out what's possible and how you might use it.
So is this what we're using our Bloomfield money to do?
That's what the Bloomberg project is.
And that's what they wanted us to do? Is that what they asked us to do?
Yeah, that's what the application. Yep, that's right.
That's what we won the prize for, was
for offering to do this.
being able to use sexy digital technology to have a conversation. And I think it's from awareness raising alone, the difference between looking at a 2-dimensional map versus looking at a 3D model of your neighbourhood. I think it'll be chalk and cheese in terms of how people absorb that information. I don't think if you asked most people on the street whether they know how to access a hazard map in the district plan, I think most of them would say no and that they've never seen one. The other piece that we're planning in the next 6 months, and we wanted your feedback on this, is whether we should do more events and meetings that are about raising awareness and listening to the community, similar to that South Coast Forum that Eugene Doyle organised alongside the other coastal communities. There's been a successful one in Eastbourne recently. After the waves overtopped, they organised an information session basically with some scientists, and it's sort of pre-adaptation planning, where you're sort of trying to get the community to understand that they are in an area that has risk, because to my point, people don't necessarily know that they're in a hazard map area. So getting them to know that they're in an area of risk,
getting them to understand what those risks look like over time, hearing from some scientists, being able to share their concerns or their, from that South Coast community, we learnt that the stormwater pipes aren't numbered, for example. So if you want to put in a Fix-It app request to clear a stormwater pipe that's coming out on a beach, you can't specifically locate it, was one of the pieces of feedback I got from one of the community members. Or so there's kind of useful tidbits you can pick up from these kind of forums. So it's not formal adaptation planning, but I still think worthwhile. So we wanted your feedback as to whether that's a worthwhile activity to do in the next 6 months or not. Yes. Okay. More of that.
Jill, did you want to just?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I was going to say, could we? Because we've done that one in Tawa for the Willowbank residents, but we know that there are other communities really keen to, I guess, have the conversation. What's that, sorry? All along the Porirua stream, there's a couple of sort of bits, I guess, actually where the bends in the stream are, but still the whole way along, really. And, yeah,
It's a good way for us to also flush out like who's super concerned and what the concerns are and what impacts they're currently seeing, as opposed to our desktop research, which shows us where the impacts are most risky.
Yeah. And I think in our situation, I'm sure Liam will agree with this, it's a little bit about, in this one, getting the regional council to come to the party a little bit. And so we need to sort of, I think we have to force these conversations a little bit, because at the moment I sort of look at our district plan and I wonder if the regional council have really been generous enough with how much corridor they've given for the stream, if they're kind of trying to sit through the safe zone and put in a few flood areas, but actually there may be there may need to be some more conversations in the future. It won't be for this district plan, but actually about how you do deal with some properties which over time are actually going to become uninhabitable, and you can tell that looking at the way things are going. But I think the regional council in that situation, and probably in a lot of them actually, we really do need to be working quite closely together, and the community actually it works better if we are working together as well.
So we are at the end, I guess. So you've got this.
I've got one more slide.
And then do we need actually a paper at some point too for making a decision? So that would just be my question. We might be good to formalise what we're going to do.
Well, the activities that we'll do in the next 6 months are the activities that we had already planned to do and that are already in Te Atakura. So that's community awareness building, Bloomberg project, the regional impact assessment. So if you see it in Te Atakura, we're already doing it. In terms of the roadmap and the community adaptation program, that is the roadmap conversation that comes back to councillors before Christmas, goes out to public consultation and gets formally adopted.
Okay,
so that's the paper.
Where does the community now have some input? Because that's Eugene's point, and I think it's fair.
Yep, so as per Laurie's comment earlier and your comment, you don't develop these things in isolation. Eugene's already given us a lot of information and feedback, and we'll continue to do so over the next few months as we develop the roadmap.
Okay, so what I'm looking for, I guess, is some community input into developing that roadmap. It still sounds very council top-heavy, and I think we need...
Took on board that feedback, yep.
So what's actually in concrete going to happen?
Well, I can't think of that on the fly.
Okay, so you'll come back to us.
Thank you for the feedback.
Yeah, you'll come back to us. Okay.
But I don't expect to come back with a paper on that, because we are entering kind of the election season. But we will take on board your feedback, and you have my word that we will involve community in the development of the roadmap.
Okay, well, we might just continue that conversation. I think we are continuing to make decisions. So, yeah. Okay, anyway, do you want to just finish that?
Yep. So in terms of resourcing constraints, a couple of you have asked, particularly when the Better Off funding application came in, what money do we already have allocated to this work and what money do we need? So at the moment we have 2 staff and we have 100K per year. That money needs to cover technical feasibility studies, research, engagement costs. Our budget for this financial year is pretty much already allocated to the regional impact assessment. So there's not a lot left over to do additional work other than the impact assessment. Better Off funding may add another 500K to that budget over the next 18 months. the Better Off funding application.
Yep, which we agreed
for
to.
the community engagement
Last week.
package, which included adaptation, so that would give us 500k for adaptation. And to put that into context, the South Dunedin Futures Program cost is 920k per year. It is a large area with a lot of people and a lot of infrastructure. It's much larger than a single coastal community for us, but still, that's just to give you an idea of the scale that you can be talking about. The Makara Beach project cost us 250k. The Ofero Bay process was real light and cost us 10k, but hasn't delivered us a pathway. It delivered us like a short-term solution we could trial to see if we could deal with upcoming storm events in the next 5 years, kind of thing. So that's why it only cost 10k. So if we, with the beach grading,
The report.
the report for the beach grading, the actual grading costs more money. So that's to give you an idea of the scale of the investment that we might be looking at. So when we come to you in the next triennium with a roadmap that will include a community engagement plan, as in, here are the different communities, we've split them up in this way, here's what it might cost to run engagement processes across all of them, and here's what it might cost to do the technical feasibility work, here's how much money we have. That gap, you will need to decide how far and how fast you wish to go, and therefore what additional resources you might want to allocate to that. And by that time, we should know whether we have the Better Off funding or not. So we'll be able to factor that into that decision.
Sarah.
So just going back to an earlier discussion where you said that this work you're doing now is funded, the work that you're demonstrating to us now, that's funded. And then I asked a question, with the Better Off funding, I think it was a couple of $1 million from memory, would that be for delivering this? And you said yes, but now I see 400k there. So are you saying?
Well, the Better Off funding application was had 4 different projects in it.
Oh, okay.
Adaptation was one of those 4 projects.
Oh, so your climate change allocation, yeah. Okay, so you're saying there were 4 projects of which they would total up to about, I think it was about 2 million, wasn't it?
3 million.
3 million, okay.
Okay.
Do you need to swap things around a bit?
Well, there's working very hard to prevent the problem and then working very hard to help prepare people to cope with the problem when it turns up. So it's that balance between trying to do both at the same time, basically.
Yeah. But, yeah.
Cool. So that's the last slide. So that detailed proposal for your approval, we've said here early 2023. I would hope to get you something before Christmas. But depending on the level of community involvement in delivering the draft, that may drift out into early next year. And we are planning to start some activities now. Are you comfortable with the activities that we've outlined? Because what we're not committing to is before Christmas starting a dynamic adaptive pathway process with any community. So that's roughly where things are standing at the moment. Because I would feel uncomfortable as an officer recommending that in the absence of having that framework and that roadmap that lays out who and when and over what time. We've already done 2 pilots, so I don't think we need another pilot. I think we need a comprehensive framework and plan so that when we go to a community, we know exactly what we're saying and what we're promising and what we're not. Yep.
That makes sense.
Awesome.
Laurie?
Yes, as long as the community is involved with that process.
Yes. Yep. Noted.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Should probably talk
Noted.
about communities because they are not
Noted.
a monolith, are they? Yep. Okay. So
And you know, communities includes a plethora of different voices. And I'm conscious that the people who have, you know, Breaker Bay was also talking to us more than a year ago. I'm really conscious that some of these communities are either the ones who are, like the waves are coming over right now, but they're also communities where there is probably a higher socioeconomic bracket than some of the other inland flooding areas like Kilbirnie, who flood every large storm but don't have the resources to come and harass councillors, or it probably wouldn't even occur to them. Some of them.
Oh, no, we do. We do. Boxing Day, I certainly did get a call one year. Yep. Because we did the infrastructure.
Yeah, we did a big one-way valve.
Okay. All right. So is that everything that you want to say, Sarah?
How does the CBD work that Jenny identified fit into this?
We put it into the roadmap, and you tell us in what order you want us to prioritise the work.
Might need
So-
It'll be for a new council.
might need to be the CBD.
For a new council, yes, and our job is to cost it out and come up with the options, and then council's job to tell us in which order to do those things.
Cool. Kia ora, Alison and team. Thank you very much for your hard work. Thank you. Unfortunately, Alison, you didn't have some of the councillors you needed to be here, but we've got the very committed here, so that's appreciated.
Question in terms of, I know that everything in council is a priority, but how do we, I guess as a council, understand that for those of us that want, how do we give an opportunity for this to become a real priority for the council? Perhaps some advice coming back.
Liam's looking thoughtful.
I'll remain thoughtful. Thank you, Alice.
Okay.
Yep.
Good.
Just understanding that, where it sits, and if we have how do we get the opportunity to
I
elevate
think
it?
probably just off the top of my head would be the infrastructure strategy. Would be how we'd foreshadow the spend. There wouldn't be any numbers in there necessarily. It'll just explain that one of the bigger challenges the city will be facing when we're dealing with those coastal communities.
Jenny.
Thanks.
I just wanted to say in the next 6 months, and kind of talking about this pre-engagement or holding some kind of pre-community meetings, that the pilots that we've had have basically been on Whero Bay and Makara, which were both coastal communities. So I would kind of say Porirua Stream, Kilburnie, bringing that alternative perspective in so that we haven't just talked to coastal communities before we have the roadmap.
Yeah.
So we bring that living with water concept to life.
Okay. Good. Thank you very much for all your. Yep. Okay. Something like that. All right.
I can't say that because I live there, so I'm in full agreement with you, but I can't propose that. So thank you. Thank you. Sarah said Roma was important.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great mahi. Thank you to those online too. I know it's always quite tricky, so thank you very much for coming along. Really appreciate it.